How did someone get fired on the spot? Story 1. This one's a bit long and convoluted, but it's worth it. We'll pick up the story where the police officer asked to talk to my parents. I was around 13 at the time. I explained that my dad was working and couldn't be reached, and my mom was out of the country. Indignantly, this total moron, we'll call Bob, starts demanding that I explain my destruction of a lawnmower. The police officer told Bob that he had the situation under control and didn't need Bob's help. The police officer asked me where I lived. I pointed to a house behind me. He asked me if I'd seen a particular lawnmower that day. I said that all lawnmowers of that model are identical except for their serial numbers, so I wasn't entirely sure, but that I knew that Bob had been cutting a lawn down the street using one just like it, while his boss Joe had some other employees and machines out doing lawns around the neighborhood. Bob starts demanding to know what I did to the brakes. The police officer again shuts Bob down and then asks me to tell him what happened with the mower Bob was on. I was starting to understand what was happening, but I knew that explaining myself wouldn't do a lot of good without proof. Instead, I asked that Bob point to the brake on his machine. He pointed. Joe's eyes went wide and his face went white. He dragged Bob off to the side. "That's the brake that you used? You're sure?" Bob was like, "Of course I'm sure. What did she do to it?" Joe looked over at me, face-palmed, and was like, "Of course you knew." The police officer directed my attention back to him and asked me again what had happened. I said what Joe already knew, but Bob obviously didn't. That wasn't the brake. It was the left turn control. The police officer asked me how I knew so much about the machines, and I explained that my dad owned a rival company to Joe's. Joe confirmed that by saying he'd seen my dad's trucks at my house before. The police officer immediately started scribbling that information down before asking me to continue. I explained that Bob had gone to pick up some trash, but instead of using the brake to stop the machine, he'd used the turn mechanism, so the machine ended up following him around as he ran in circles trying to catch it, which I thought was hilarious, so I'd stop to watch and laugh. I further explained that I wouldn't have left the out-of-control mower hurt anyone or do any damage. It was in an open enough area, and the blades were well guarded. I looked over at Joe and told him that if I'd known Bob was an idiot, I would have stopped the machine and then taken away the keys. The police officer flips his little notebook closed. "So let me see if I've got this straight. Your employee, through his own gross incompetence, managed to break your lawnmower. He then blamed it on your competitor's child. Am I missing anything?" Joe says, "My former employee." The police officer was like, "Well, that sounds like there's nothing else for me to do here." Bob starts telling Joe that he can't be fired, and Joe's just like, "Shut up before I dock your pay to fix my mower and have your car towed off my property." After he took a minute to cool down, Joe came over and asked me not to tell my dad about this. Not to tell my dad about this? I'm guessing he was terrified of the local news being informed. "How far would you go to keep up with the Joneses? Would you try to have your competition's young child arrested for your employee's bad behavior? One local company is accused of doing just that, more at 11. He asked if there was anything he could do for me, and I asked for an ice cream, which he went and bought. When he came back, he patted me on the head and told me I was a good kid. When Joe retired, he thanked my dad for not destroying him when he had the chance. My dad was confused, but I just was quietly like, "You're welcome." I didn't end up telling my dad the story until long after they both retired. I just enjoyed my ice cream and my secret hilarious story of the idiot who got chased in circles by a lawnmower because he was too dumb to make sure he knew how to stop a 500-pound machine of spinning blades before he took control of it. It still brings a smile to my face decades later. Is there no training? Did they ask this person if they knew how to operate a lawnmower? That particular lawnmower? And this kid is just sitting here, has more of his wits about him than pretty much anybody else in this story. That was pretty much worth it. And hey, he got ice cream out of it. She got ice cream out of it, I should say. That's what the person in the story is. She was called she in here. That's right. Story 2. I have 2 census ones myself. 1. New girl started yelling in the office about how her boyfriend broke up with her because our supervisor asked her to take lunch at an inconvenient time. 2. This is an interesting one. Claimed she had some family in politics, kind of full of hot air. She had some red flags initially in my convos, little tinfoil hat snippets with her, but nothing fireable. But after some time, there were repeated instances of confrontational behavior in office. Getting defensive when her work was critiqued, accusing others of malicious intent because you're all out to get me. And she did not get along with my supervisor. One day, in an office chat, my supervisor expressed frustration because a few people, including her, were talking quite loudly. He didn't say anything because he knew she would take it hostilely, and he didn't want to start anything. Thinking I could help, I decided to go over and very politely ask them to lower the volume just a little. The other few apologized and gladly agreed. She rolled her eyes and said to them in a mocking tone, "Supervisor told her to do that." This bugged me. I walked over to her, looked at her, and urged that he didn't. She gave me a look, that one problem child in a class trying to tick off the teacher. Like that. She rolled her eyes and said, "You can stare at me all you want," in a goading tone. At this point, I was super hormonal, so it took every iota of will I had not to smack the look off her face. I walked away very, very mad. Supervisor said that was the last straw and spoke to the manager about her attitude. Last I saw of her was her storming out of the manager's office, declaring loudly, "I'm calling Washington." If she did, we certainly never heard back from them. Was this before the definition of Karen or after? Because all this behavior is just her embodying that whole lifestyle. And, geez, how many chances did she get before she was... what was the time period of this before people had finally had enough of her? I guess we had to wait for a fireable offense, and she was willing to hand them out like ice cream that was being bought to cover up the incident of a lawnmower. Story 3. I had a nurse that would take care of me because I needed help with medical stuff. The nurse was great until a lot of family problems started happening, and she tried to parent me. I think I was probably 8 or close to that. The things that I needed help with were usually related to respiratory stuff, suctioning the junk out of my throat. But in this case, it was more because I needed orthotics. Otherwise, my feet would collapse on themselves. The day she was fired, it was pajama day. A couple students were selected to throw a pie in a teacher's face. I was one of them. And the book from Scholastics came. Since it was pajama day, I wanted to wear my slippers rather than my shoes, which had the orthotics in them. And instead of my nurse persuading me to wear them, she just gave in. I was also so focused on reading the book that I got that I left the stuffed animal that I brought on the bus. Instead of the nurse reminding me to put the book away so I don't forget Silver Snow, she cared less, and I started crying about Silver Snow the moment we got home. Mom realized that I was wearing my slippers and not my shoes, so she calmly asked, "Why does my name not have her shoes on?" The nurse kept avoiding the question by saying, "There isn't enough time from recess to the bus," which is not true, and I called her out. The moment I did, she blew up like a volcano, picking up papers, putting them down elsewhere, and saying stuff like, "You never do enough for me." While Mom tries to calm her down, I run behind my parents' door because I have never seen the nurse do this before. Mom has had enough of her BS and kicks her out, and said that she was never allowed back. This was the end of that. I cried a lot. Then my sister came home, and we all went to watch the movie Mary and the Witch's Flower. We've had a lot of bad nurses since then, and because of that, my mom started to do what the nurses did. Not neglect, but come in with me to school so I would be suctioned and other things. This nurse was supposed to go with this person to school to hang around? How old was this nurse? I have never heard of that kind of a situation before. I'm not sure what kind of school this was. Was it a private school that allowed that, or was it a public school that allowed that? Have you ever had a student that had to have a nurse follow them around during the day? It's a new one to me. Story 4. I worked as a beggar/cart collector at a Sprouts grocery store from 2011 to 2015. I've seen 3 people get fired on the spot during my time working there. The first person was, in fact, my department manager on a day when I wasn't scheduled to work. I came in to pick up my paycheck and find out my schedule for next week. In the manager's office, I find the HR supervisor lady only with my department supervisor, who is sitting down dressed in his everyday clothes instead of his work clothes. I greeted them and he just said, "Hey." Then after that, I never saw him again. I had no idea he just got fired on the spot. Apparently, he got fired for unwanted harassment by hugging a female customer he kind of knows in front of her husband, who got extremely butthurt and reported him to corporate. So not only was he fired, he was also barred for life from setting foot in that particular store. Another person who I witnessed get fired on the spot worked in the meat department. He showed up to work on a day he was not scheduled in his everyday clothes, standing near the manager's office. I asked what he was doing here since we weren't scheduled to work today. He said he had a meeting with the store manager. Then, a day later, my coworkers told me he was fired for stealing meat from his department. Another coworker of mine who works in produce had a very long beard and reeked of booze. He managed to work there for an entire year till one day some customer complained about the smell he had. Apparently, he was caught red-handed drinking on the job. The ASM told him to report to the office, and after that, I never saw him again. Story 5. I got 2 stories. First was relatively mild. The second, well, you'll see. I worked at a zoo snack stand for my first job. One day, as I'm getting my register ready, a girl who had only started a week or 2 earlier walks in and is immediately greeted by the manager telling her she no longer works there, as apparently the day before she left her post without being formally dismissed by a manager/supervisor. She initially argued that she had been, but quickly gave up, handed her employee badge in, and left. Second job was at a restaurant at a popular tourist destination. During my second year, there was a growing conflict between one server who had been there since before me and 2 others who had started that year and were dating. I'm not clear on the details, but conflict was growing between them for a couple weeks, to the point where the former server was being threatened with firing. One day, I see her and two of my supervisors sitting down having what seemed to be a pretty serious discussion. I don't know what about, but that was the last time I saw her, on the job or anywhere, though the couple would also be gone within a couple months.
Please like and subscribe if you made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day.
Story 6. I worked as a licensed nurse in a convalescent home in the early 1990s. On the PM shift, we had a problem with two CNAs, nursing assistants, that would disappear for an hour at a time from their stations. Still on the clock, just nowhere to be found, and wouldn't answer pages. They were caught a couple times on a neighboring station. They said they were helping other nurses, so they kept getting away with this for a couple of weeks. One night, one of their patients had coded, perished, and the other CNAs were frantically trying to find the one who had the patient. About 10 minutes later, I'm standing in front of the facility with a family member, my supervisor, and up drives the two CNAs, and they park around the back of their station. As they're coming back into what was a secured door, they got busted. We took them directly to the administrator's office. They were terminated, stripped of their documents, and the one who had the room was held while the ombudsman was called by the family. After about 2 hours of interviews by local cops and the ombudsman, she was escorted out of the facility. A few days later, she was charged with elder abuse, and she lost her license. While she wasn't convicted for the unaliving, the family did sue the facility for negligence and won, and she was prohibited to ever work in a licensed healthcare job again. Why were they on a neighboring station? Was it elder abuse as some kind of compulsion for them that they just tried to get away with by being on the neighboring station? I thought that maybe they were trying to sneak pharmaceuticals out and they didn't want it to be on record on their own station. It's kind of tragic. I think the facility probably had a really harsh time trying to deal with this lawsuit. Although, technically, I guess they are compliant in the negligence of this. They probably should have had a closer eye on everybody. It's very tragic considering this involving an unaliving of a family member. Story 7. 2 stories. This was recent. Apparently, we had a new stable hand who didn't show up. I told one of the handlers, someone who leads a horse from its box to one of the paddocks and back again later, that it was just me and one other guy working on boxes, and she said, "Yeah, he has a habit of not showing up." I get the roster, and the no-show was on all through the week. I'm a casual worker, so I'm on 2 or 3 days a week, so I don't know if he showed up at any other time in the week. The next week, I see his name is not on the roster. The other story happened years ago. I was still fairly new to my job, and it was pouring down rain. We had 2 new girls who were in boxes with me. I only saw them once or twice that morning, and soon enough, it was just me, all alone, in the bucketing rain. Even my wheelbarrow full of horse dung and mud tipped over. The next day, I learned from another that the 2 girls walked off the job because one claimed her hands were cold and the other was getting blisters on her hands. This is reality, pony princesses. You don't work at a stable and not expect your hands to get a little scuffed up. Story 8. I worked at a traffic flagging company. This one day, I was riding with my crewmate and we both needed to go to the office. We were going down the highway when we came up behind a guy who was driving a little slower than the rest of the people. It wasn't too slow. The speed limit was 55 and the guy was doing roughly 57 to 59. So my crewmate decides to drive around him and brake check him. The guy slammed on his brakes and my crewmate sped up. He then brake checks him again 2 more times after that. I told my crewmate to stop, but he just laughs as he continues to tick off the slower guy. We get a little worried when the guy follows us to the office. Turns out, it was the owner of the company my crewmate was brake checking. We get out of the work van, and my crewmate is laughing his butt off for a stupid stunt. His face went from laughter to pure horror when he sees who he was brake checking. The owner grabs the keys out of his hand. He then yells at him to get the hell out of his face and that he's fired. That crewmate was never seen or heard from after that. Story 9. And how? When I was in college, I had a part-time job as a security guard. One time I was sent to a building site on the other side of town, nearly out of Greater London. There would be 2 guards during the night, doing rounds every hour. It was a big site, so this could take half an hour, and spending the rest of the time in the site office, which was heated and had a kettle to make tea. Better than some sites I've done, let me tell you. Now, unfortunately, after a few nights on the site, I got a new partner. This idiot informs me that he's going to spend his time sleeping in the office, and I could do all the staying awake and guarding. Well, it was that or having a fight, which would not have improved matters. So I just started doing my job and his as well. What the idiot did not expect was that very night there was an inspection by the company boss, who found me doing the rounds alone, got the whole story, went to the office, woke the jerk up, sacked him on the spot, and left him to make his own way back home at 2 o'clock in the morning in outer London with no public transport and no money. I worked security before. I actually worked security with a group for a wing of a hotel that was being constructed, and we kept moving as the floors were completed. There was one person I saw that I had heard was telling another of the guards to get out of there and leave her alone, and I had peeked in, and she was laying down on one of the finished beds, taking a nap. And she was ordering this other person around like she was a supervisor. She didn't last long after that day. I actually ended up being the last person on the final floor after everything was being finalized. Story 10. In my 20s, I worked at a local fish and chip stand. One summer, a teenage girl was hired who obviously didn't want to be there. Not sure why she was even there, unless her parents forced her to get a job or something like that. She was often late or just absent and hardly did any work when she was there. When you tried to teach her how to do something, it was in one ear and out the other. She frequently took bathroom breaks so long that people were actually sent to go get her. To be fair, the nearest bathroom was at the gas station across the street, but most of the time she wasn't in there. She was at the adjoining liquor store. She wasn't old enough to drink, but her boyfriend worked there. The last straw was when she came into work and spent most of her shift in the bathroom. This time, she actually was in the bathroom throwing up. She had come to work at a food place with a severe flu. The one time she had a legit excuse. Her reasoning was that the manager told her if she missed one more shift, she would be fired. He told her to go home. The icing on the cake was that was our busiest day to date. We broke records and didn't finish until hours after close. I realize this isn't her fault, but being short-handed sure the hell didn't make it easier. Story 11. There was a guy who worked at an old workplace of mine who was a complete little turd. He was the son of the secretary, who herself even admitted he could be a nightmare, yet never seemed to do anything about it. The guy was spoiled, rude, and just overall a brat. He committed many sackable offenses, but top management just seemed to brush them off. Finally, one day, the managing director's young nephew, who was doing some work experience at the company for a couple of weeks, completely by accident pushed Brat while he was walking past carrying something. Brat completely flipped out and punched the poor kid in the face. Needless to say, the managing director couldn't just ignore that one, and Brat was immediately fired. If they had just sacked him previously when they should have done, that never would have happened. Story 12. I was working as a bartender in college and grad school, and I got called in by the bar's owner to handle something. She shows me a video of my manager pocketing cash out of the register. Turns out he'd been voiding items off people's bills, doing the math in his head, and pocketing the change for what he'd voided off the purchases. The owner had secretly set up cameras aimed at the bar, kitchen and storage area when he noticed the inventory was coming up short for recorded sales. She had assumed someone was giving out food and drinks for free. My first task as the new manager was to fire my predecessor as the cops handcuffed him. The owner then anonymously called up every other bar in town and sent them a link to a video showing my predecessor pocketing cash out of the register. He accepted a plea deal to pay $850 for the cash he'd stolen, another $500 in punitive damages, and was sentenced to 5 years probation plus community service. He left town a few years later, being unable to get another job bartending. Story 13. This kid didn't get fired, but I got a call at a pizza shop I worked at in college. She was kind of laughing while telling me this, which made me think this is some high college kid or just a prank call. But she said that her pizza was completely smashed on one side of the box. So I gave her the usual spiel, comping her order and sending her a new one for free, and she mentioned that she thought the pizza was smashed because she saw the delivery driver doing kickflips off his skateboard while holding the pizza. I was baffled, to say the least, so I got off the phone and he came back and I asked him, "Be completely honest with me. Were you riding your skateboard while delivering pizza?" Him? Yeah. I brought him over to the shift manager and just told him to tell the shift manager what he told me. The kid got yelled at, but wasn't fired, surprisingly. And he did have a car, he just thought it was a good time to take out his skateboard and do some sick kickflips. Story 14. Guy in my lab was working on a project for the DoD. He visited the Pentagon to meet up with the project's Navy contact for a short meeting before lunch. After clearing security, he decided to use the bathroom first. There was another guy using a urinal, so he gave the courtesy nod and proceeded to do his business. The other guy finished up, washed his hands, and left. My coworker finished, went to wash his hands, and noticed a stack of papers next to the sink prominently marked secret, the level in between classified and top secret. He tracked down a security guard and handed the papers over to him, then went to his meeting. After they finished and were walking out of the Pentagon for lunch, they saw the guy who had been in the bathroom being escorted out by security guards in handcuffs.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.